Hello there, guys, and today we are going to talk about the boot process. What we are going to discuss is a simplified boot process which tells us how it all begins. Okay, so how does your computer boot up? Well, the first step is that a bootloader is ran by a machine's BIOS or boot firmware. And basically, I'm just going to abbreviate this step as a boot loader. Okay, so again, to repeat what the first step is, a bootloader is ran by machine's BIOS or other boot firmware. Okay, then the second step is the bootloader finds the kernel image on disk, loads it into memory, and starts it. So we'll say that the second step is the kernel. Okay. Then the third step, the kernel initiates the hardware devices and its drivers. Okay, so we can call the third step drivers. Then the fourth step, and we'll go through this again. Just let me write all of these down and then I'll kind of globally go through this again. The fourth step is the kernel mounts the root file system. Okay, so we can write the step as mounting root. Okay, root file system, root FS. Then fifth step is the kernel starts a program called init. Okay, and this init has a PID equal to 1. Then init starts other processes. Okay, so I'll write this as other necessary processes. Okay, processes. And then what happens in the end is that at some point at or near this entire process, I get the option to log into my system. Okay, so my login option is the final step, and that's when the operating system asks me to log in. Okay, so let's again go through all of the steps bit by bit, one step at a time. Okay, so the first step, as I already discussed, is that a bootloader is ran by machine's BIOS or boot firmware. Now, what is BIOS? BIOS stands for Basic Input Output System, and it is used to check for hardware errors and run the bootloader. Okay, so basically what we could write here, kind of add it here, is that BIOS actually starts the bootloader. You can think of BIOS as the starting point of your computer. When you turn your computer on, it checks if all the hardware is okay, and if it is, it runs the bootloader. Instead of BIOS, you can have other boot firmware, such as UEFI, Unified Extensible Firmware Interface, but basically the job of both BIOS and other boot firmware is to check the hardware, and if that's okay, then run the bootloader. Okay, and now what is this bootloader? The bootloader is a small program whose task is to find the kernel image on disk, load it into memory, and start it. Okay, so basically that's the bootloader's job, and that's what happens in the second step, because in the second step what happens is that the bootloader finds the kernel image on disk and loads it into memory and starts it. Okay, then the third step, so basically the first step, bootloader loads the kernel. The second step, the first step is not that. The first step is that the bootloader is ran by machine's BIOS or boot firmware. Then the second step is that the bootloader, which was loaded in the first step by BIOS or boot firmware, is actually searching for the kernel image, and then when it finds it, it loads it into memory and starts it. The third step is that the kernel, okay, so the kernel, so basically the steps, you can visualize the steps as follows. Okay, so each step precedes the following step, and basically I enumerated them with numbers, but you can, just to emphasize, just imagine them going sequentially. So we go from BIOS, which can be, for example, the 0th step, to the bootloader. Then the bootloader initializes the kernel. Then the kernel initializes the hardware devices and the drivers. Then the kernel, okay, basically the kernel actually does this, so this doesn't exist. Then the kernel mounts the root file system, but technically you do need to initialize the drivers beforehand, and even though technically the kernel mounts the root file systems, you still need to have the hardware devices in place for that. Then the fifth thing, what happens after mounting the root file system, is that the kernel starts a program called init, and init has a PID equal to 1. So basically the kernel is also doing this, but again, for it to start init, all of these other things have to be in place, right? The root file system has to be mounted, and you need to be able to interact with the hardware devices via their drivers. Then init starts all of the other necessary system processes, okay? So init does this, and then at some point later on, or near the end of this entire process, you get the option to log in to your system. Okay, and so just to clarify what is init, although we will talk about init in a different tutorial, init is a special process whose task is to start all of the other necessary system processes, and init always has a process ID of 1. Okay, so this was basically the overview of the boot process. I think you kind of understood it. I mean, it was a lot of information, but I think you kind of understood everything which I said. And if you did, I would be really proud of that, right? Because I think we covered all of these things in previous tutorials, and this is the tutorial where it all kind of comes together. And although, yeah, there are new information about the sequence of the events, however, there should be nothing confusing, or maybe BIOS is new, so this is new, and the bootloader is new, but all of these other things, they shouldn't be that confusing, because we already talked about mounting, we talked about the kernel, we talked about drivers, or maybe not directly, but I said in one of the videos that drivers are used to control their hardware devices. We didn't talk about init, okay, but we do know that it's a process, and we talked about processes and process IDs, etc. And basically this step is also processes, and then basically this last step is just, for you to be able to log in. That's nothing special there. Okay, so again, there is some new information, but I think that most of this information shouldn't be that new, okay, if you paid attention to previous tutorials. Okay, so definitely do leave me feedback how you're liking the series. Again, I will most likely pre-record the entire series, but I will read through the feedback, because I'm just curious, how are you finding the series? Is it too fast, too slow? Do you find some things annoying? Do you find some things awesome? Definitely do leave me feedback, okay? So thank you for watching. Hope you'll leave feedback, share the series, subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. Talk soon.